Hey guys, welcome into this video where I'm going to be going over how protections and penetration work in Smite, what I like to call Smite's damage arms race, this race to be too tanky to kill and to kill the tanks in front of you. So, the very unique interplay most commonly seen between frontline and backline. So, the first thing I'm going to go into, how do protections make someone tanky? So using the equation in the top right, you can turn protections into mitigation. Mitigation is just a number between 0 and 1 that gets multiplied onto the base damage of something to get to the actual number that shows up over your head and impacts your health bar. So 100 divided by 100 plus protections. A little bit of a weird equation. It graphs out as the line on your screen with the vertical bar for protection, the red bar being the protection cap. One of the interesting things you'll see is as you gain protections, that next bit of protections does less for you than the previous one. So going from 0 to 100 protections takes you from taking full damage to half damage, but going from 100 to 200 protections takes you from taking half damage to taking a third damage. So each sort of step along the way is going to be slightly less effective technically, but not everything works in a vacuum. To put everything in context, gods in Smite have base protections that they just gain as they level. So I'm going to give out the numbers that essentially all gods will have at level 20 in terms of protections. So pretty much all gods will have around 48 to 50 magical protections at level 20. They don't start with them, but they get there. Physical protections break down a bit between squishies and tanks, so squishies being the traditional classes of hunter, mage, and assassin. They'll have around 70 protections at level 20, and then tanks will have a little bit more at around 80. This is with no items built whatsoever. Just hit level 20, that's the amount of protections you're likely to have. Using protections and sort of turning that mitigation number into something that's a little easier to understand, I'm going to go with a great term coined by Word of Thoth, Flareboot in Word of Thoth, and use effective HP. So, effective HP sort of flips the damage calculation on its head to say how much base damage can you take before you die, rather than saying, oh, I've got the base damage that deals this amount of damage to my health bar. I'm going to say I have this much HP that, when divided by this amount of mitigation, turns into this amount of HP. It's a way of describing how tanky someone is. So, the numbers on screen mainly have to do with when you're taking damage from the environment, things like Fire Giant or Gold Fury, but that's its own thing that we're going to get into when we get into the other half of the arms race. Good rules of thumb or numbers to keep in mind. 100 protections is sort of the sweet spot, makes you twice as tanky as you'd normally be. 200 protections makes you 3 times as tanky, and 100 protections with an item that gives you 25% more health, so you have your base amount of health and then you add 25% to it, that's 250% HP. So there's a bit of interplay between protections and health, and essentially what it boils down to is you want a blend of protections and health. Having just building a bunch of protections or just building a bunch of health isn't going to do you nearly as much as building a blend of the two. Moving to the other half of this arms race, how do you deal with a bunch of protections? You don't just build a bunch of power, you build a lot of penetration and protection reduction. So, how does all of that work? Alright, well, I start the top with a very nerdy equation that allows you to do a bunch of fun algebra stuff. But in more layman's terms, it happens in the adjustment to the amount of protections you effectively have happens in this order. You have your base protections that show up on the bottom left of your screen times 1 minus the percent reduction. This is things like void stone, void shield, stone cutting, executioner. They reduce your protections for every damage source. And then you have flat reduction. Flat reduction is things like stone cutting. My bad, I misspoke earlier. Those are things that impact you globally. If you have a percent reduction on your protections, every damage source gets to benefit from it. Then then you get into the more specific one, percent pen and flat pen. Percent pen and flat pen specifically are the person hitting you has this stat. So if a mid laner has 40% pen and 15 flat pen, or 10 flat pen, more likely, 40% pen and 10 flat pen, you effectively have 60% minus 10 of your protections. And then if there's any aura prot reduction, it runs through the list, and it gets really messy to do all of the comparisons. But there's certain things that we know based off of this. First of all, flat pen doesn't scale on its own. So the number on I'm showing in this calculation on the left side of your screen is the mitigation that someone has when you have that stat, 10% pen or 10 flat pen, minus the mitigation that they have if you don't have that stat, and that gives you sort of the impact on their tankiness that you have from building that stat. So if I build 10% pen and my opponent has 80 protections, I'm going to do nearly 3% more, or almost 3% more damage. If they have 200 base protections, little less, near 2.5% more damage, and 325, almost 2. So it's not doing that as well as you go through. But if you compare that to flat pen, at 80 base protections, it's doing 3% more damage. It's pretty nice. And then you've got 200 base protections. Oh crud, that drops all the way to 1%. 0.5% at 325. Like it just hard tanks over time. But the numbers I did not crunch but probably should have, if you have both, the percent pen applies first, and then the flat pen, which means that you're getting the full benefit of flat pen at its most effective. As your opponent has fewer and fewer protections, flat pen has a bigger and bigger impact. So because flat pen gets applied last, it really wants percent pen in order for it to scale well. That is the main takeaway here. This is my least favorite topic to cover when it comes to pen and armor reduction, or prot reduction. I used the terms interchangeably a lot in my research, sadly. So, you will hear some people, I'll throw Reddit under the bus, saying that executioner and dominance don't play nicely together. You shouldn't build both of them. Or a bunch of jargon about armor reduction and percent pen don't like each other and they don't play well. It is technically true. The numbers that I crunched on screen are a bit hard to explain, but essentially what I came down to is, it's an old set of numbers for dominance, but you get the idea. The impact of having prot shred and percent pen means that you lose a tiny bit of effectiveness technically. So some people will say, oh, if you have the 28% from armor reduction and 20% from dominance, you're going to have 48%. You actually end up with around 43%. Oh, whoopsie. Like, oh no, I still have 43%. That's more than you can build in terms of percent pen on paper. And passives are their own thing and allow you to go over cap, and it's this whole mess. Essentially, what I wanted to do here was cut it off at the past. You're going to hear people saying that you don't want to build both. They just haven't run the numbers. It is such a rare situation where you really don't want to build both. Building both is perfectly fine. Having just said that, I am now going to backtrack slightly. Stone of Binding is a very special case. So, conditional effects like Stone of Binding happen out of order. They have their own special slot in the application, and it is messy. The long and the short of it is, Stone of Binding doesn't play nicely with any percent impact. So any percent reduction or any percent pen. So the 10 flat reduction that you have from Stone of Binding in the late game is really like 6 or 5. So it's really not doing much for anyone, and is probably worth swapping out for an item that's going to make your tanks tankier and give you more, or even give them like a flat pen option, something that's going to have a bigger impact for them and for your team as a whole. It is a cheap item. It's one of the last remnants of the bridge items in Smite right now. But yes, conditional effects, very wonky. They happen at weird times in the calculation order. Stone of Binding, worth selling late, still worth having early. For those of you who really didn't feel like sitting through this whole thing, I had it pinned as part of the video that you could jump to this point. Here's the TLDR of the whole thing. You really need, if you're trying to be tanky, to blend protections and health. Percent pen is really, really good late game and fairly good early. Percent pen and percent prot shred technically don't play nice. Yes, the people will harp on you about it. Don't worry about it. It's still really good. And flat pen is really, really good early and only does well late when paired with percent pen or percent prot shred. And then the other things that I have here are more so just didn't have a huge spot in this video, but felt like I needed to rehash them. You get mitigation from protections based on the equation in the bottom right, and the stats that you have in the bottom left of your screen in Smite, from top to bottom, are basic attack power, power, physical protections, magical protections, move speed, and attack speed. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, enjoyed it, got some good info out of it, feel free to like and subscribe. It really helps me out a lot. I'm looking forward to making a lot more videos like this going forward, giving a unique set of guides on how the core fundamentals of Smite work is a huge passion of mine, helping out new players and experienced players who never bothered to learn this stuff in the first place. Thank you guys so much. For those of you who really want to stick around, and obviously you just sat through my whole like and subscribe spiel, here's your extra homework. Go read Word of Thoth. There's other forms of tankiness. You have what I like to call stat silos, which means that each silo has their own calculation to get to mitigations, and then you multiply the damage times all of those silos results. So you have the mitigations from protections, you have percent damage dealt, most commonly reduction or increase, so this is for the opponent who's hitting you, and then you have percent damage taken, increase, and reduction, which is all just additive. And then conditionals are their own silo yet again. Luckily though, it's all multiplication, so order doesn't matter. Conditionals are things like Runeforged and Artemis passive, and they have their own silo that adds separately. But yes, thank you guys so much. I can't harp on this enough. Thank you for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.